The room reeked of rotting flesh masked by sweet perfumes. Beneath layers of silk, crimson velvet, and golden embroidery sat a man whose leg leaked pus into his throne cushion. The air was thick silent, except for the buzzing of flies and the faint groan that slipped from his cracked lips. A crown still rested on his head, but his soul. His soul had long since left the body. This was Henry IV, not the virile warrior painted in his youth, but the bloated relic of power decaying from within. But how did it come to this? How does a man, once the image of Renaissance majesty, tall, athletic, a scholar, a king beloved by many, end up rotting from the inside out, both body and legacy? To understand that, we must go back to a time when the candles still burned bright in Henry's soul. In his youth, Henry was the dream of England. Tall and broad-shouldered, he excelled at jousting, dancing, poetry, and theology. He was not meant to be king, his older brother Arthur was. But when Arthur died suddenly, young Henry was thrust into the role of monarch at just 17. At first it seemed a divine plan. The kingdom rejoiced. Henry was charming, bold, ambitious. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, to solidify an alliance with Spain. Their marriage began with laughter and loyalty, but beneath the surface, Henry carried a wound, a deep, gnawing fear, the fear of fading, of being forgotten, of dying without a son to inherit his legacy. This fear, this obsession, it would soon grow teeth. For the first 2 decades of his reign, Henry ruled like a golden prince. He modernized England's navy, defended Catholicism against the Protestant Reformation, and held court like a god among men. Foreign dignitaries admired him. His people adored him. But the cradle remained empty. Catherine gave birth to several children, but only one survived, a daughter, Mary. No son, no heir. And with each failed pregnancy, Henry's anxiety twisted tighter. He began to see God's silence as a punishment, or perhaps Catherine's womb as cursed. And then came Anne Boleyn. Anne was everything Catherine wasn't: young, witty, sharp-tongued, and flirtatious. To Henry, she wasn't just a mistress, she was a second chance, a divine correction, the woman who would give him the son fate had denied. But there was a problem. The Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, and it was here that the first crack split Henry's crown. Unable to secure an annulment from Rome, Henry tore England from the Catholic Church. He crowned himself head of a new church, the Church of England, and married Anne in secret. He excommunicated himself. He seized monasteries. He turned scripture into justification. He had rewritten the divine. But the heavens remained silent. Anne bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. His frustration turned to fury. His paranoia deepened. He began to view Anne not as salvation, but as betrayal in disguise. The man who had once charmed Europe was beginning to show rot beneath the robe. By 1536, Henry ordered Anne's arrest. She was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft charges most historians believe were fabricated. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London. And in one final, chilling act of control, Henry hired a French swordsman for her execution, so the blade would be clean and swift. She died quietly. He wore white to her funeral, and within days he was engaged to his next wife. What began as religious rebellion had become ritual bloodletting, and it was only the beginning. Behind the glimmering gold, something inside Henry had started to die. Not just his empathy, not just his patience, but his very humanity. He still danced at court. He still gave rousing speeches. But those closest to him began to speak in hushed tones. His mood changed without warning. His appetite grew, and a festering wound, a jousting injury in his leg, refused to heal. It oozed, it reeked, and some whispered that it was not his leg that had become infected, but his soul. The smell was getting harder to mask. Courtiers began keeping their distance. Servants exchanged glances when Henry passed. The once magnificent king had begun to stink of death before dying. But worse than the odor was the mood. A man who once inspired loyalty and admiration now ruled with the weight of unpredictable rage. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's execution. This time Henry finally got what he always wanted, a son, Edward. But the cost was staggering. Jane died just days after childbirth, some say from puerperal fever. Others claim it was simply exhaustion, the brutal toll of royal childbirth. Henry mourned her, publicly at least, calling her his only true wife. Yet behind the grief, something darker stirred. The wound in his leg grew deeper. Doctors applied honey, wine, and even animal fat, but nothing worked. The pain was constant. It seeped into his thoughts, corroded his mind. Unable to secure an annulment from Rome, Henry tore England from the Catholic Church. He crowned himself head of a new church, the Church of England, and married Anne in secret. He excommunicated himself. He seized monasteries. He turned scripture into justification. He had rewritten the divine. But the heavens remained silent. Anne bore him a daughter Elizabeth, but no son. His frustration turned to fury. His paranoia deepened. He began to view Anne not as salvation, but as betrayal in disguise. The man who had once charmed Europe was beginning to show rot beneath the robe. By 1536, Henry ordered Anne's arrest. She was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft charges most historians believe were fabricated. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London. And in one final, chilling act of control, Henry hired a French swordsman for her execution, so the blade would be clean and swift. She died quietly. He wore white to her funeral, and within days he was engaged to his next wife. What began as religious rebellion had become ritual bloodletting, and it was only the beginning. Behind the glimmering gold, something inside Henry had started to die. Not just his empathy, not just his patience, but his very humanity. He still danced at court. He still gave rousing speeches. But those closest to him began to speak in hushed tones. His mood changed without warning. His appetite grew, and a festering wound, a jousting injury in his leg, refused to heal. It oozed, it reeked, and some whispered that it was not his leg that had become infected, but his soul. The smell was getting harder to mask. Courtiers began keeping their distance. Servants exchanged glances when Henry passed. The once magnificent king had begun to stink of death before dying. But worse than the odor was the mood. A man who once inspired loyalty and admiration now ruled with the weight of unpredictable rage. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's execution. This time Henry finally got what he always wanted, a son, Edward. But the cost was staggering. Jane died just days after childbirth, some say from puerperal fever. Others claim it was simply exhaustion, the brutal toll of royal childbirth. Henry mourned her, publicly at least, calling her his only true wife. Yet behind the grief, something darker stirred. The wound in his leg grew deeper. Doctors applied honey, wine, and even animal fat, but nothing worked. The pain was constant. It seeped into his thoughts, corroded his mind. He lashed out at ministers, executed friends, banished once trusted advisors, and still he kept eating. Henry consumed enough food for 3 grown men each day. Entire pigs, barrels of wine, salted fish, sugared fruits. His waistline ballooned, his body slowed, and worst of all, he refused to stop. Some said he believed food gave him power. Others whispered that he ate to numb himself. But either way, his court watched in horror as the king's body began to mirror his soul, bloated, broken, and poisoned by excess. When he married his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, she reportedly recoiled at his appearance. His face was swollen, ulcerated, his breath rank, his leg bandaged tightly beneath jeweled hose. Henry found her repulsive. He claimed she had evil smells about her. Days later, the marriage was annulled. Anne, wise enough to play meek and grateful, survived. She thanked him publicly, smiled through gritted teeth, and vanished into quiet wealth. But survival in Henry's court wasn't guaranteed for everyone. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, was just a teenager when they married. Beautiful, vivacious, and naive. Henry, now obese and nearing 50, called her his rose without a thorn. But when he discovered her past youthful romances, letters, love poems, his fury returned. It wasn't enough to end the marriage. Henry created a law making it treason to conceal sexual history from the king. Catherine was arrested, tried, and beheaded. It was said she practiced her final words for hours before her execution. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." She was 19. Henry had her executed in the same place he killed Anne Boleyn. Some say he never visited that tower again. And still he kept eating. Each bite was a distraction, each feast a denial. His body grew grotesque. His leg ulcer ruptured constantly. Servants stuffed his throne with sweet-smelling herbs and fresh cloth to soak the rot. But the wound refused to close. He could no longer walk unassisted. His once proud armor had to be widened to fit his girth over 54 inches around the waist. But the armor no longer protected him from the thing he feared most, decay. By now, Henry ruled through fear alone. He executed Thomas More, his brilliant advisor. He sent Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne Boleyn's downfall, to the scaffold too. One after another, friends became enemies. Allies became corpses. His court was silent. No laughter, no truth, only survival. In these years, Henry married one last time Catherine Parr, a mature and educated woman who wisely played the part of loyal companion and nursemaid. She bathed his sores. She kept him company. She asked no questions. But she also kept a copy of his will hidden at all times, fearing that his rage could turn on her at any moment. By the early 1540s, Henry had become a monster seated on velvet, surrounded by yes-men and ghosts. He still held court, but only behind curtains, seated, unable to stand for long. And yet he believed himself eternal, chosen, a divine ruler immune to the laws of flesh. He ordered new portraits, ones that made him appear youthful, strong, regal, paintings that hid the rot beneath bright reds and golden embroidery. But the walls were cracking. Behind the scent of rosewater and incense, everyone could smell it. The king was dying, and the worst was yet to come. The year was 1546. The once great monarch, who had split an entire nation from the church, now couldn't climb stairs without help. Beneath his robes, the wound on his leg had become a cavern of rot, open, infected, and infested. His physicians, desperate, applied poultices of crushed rose petals, honey, even moss from cathedral walls.
Nothing worked.
The ulcer smelled of death, and so did the room he slept in. They burned incense in every corner, fresh herbs under his pillows. But every servant, every wife, every advisor who stepped into the royal chambers knew. They were standing in the presence of a dying god, and Henry knew it too. He no longer trusted anyone. Every letter, every whisper was suspect. He spoke of conspiracies. He believed courtiers were planning to poison him. He accused his own children of disloyalty. He changed his will constantly, scratching names out with shaking hands. And still he ruled. He signed decrees from his bed, lashed out at Parliament, and demanded total obedience. But his body was no longer his own. He couldn't dress himself, couldn't relieve himself without help, couldn't sleep more than a few hours without waking in pain. He spent hours alone, muttering about past wives, past enemies. Sometimes he'd weep, sometimes he'd laugh. One servant said he heard Henry talking to the ghost of Anne Boleyn. Another said they once found him in the chapel, crawling, sobbing, begging God for mercy. But by then, God had gone silent. The final months were something worse than dying. His leg had to be lanced daily. The pus, thick and yellow, sometimes spilled onto the floor. The smell filled the palace corridors. His sheets stained red and black. His body bloated, misshapen. He could barely be moved without screaming. But no one dared speak of it. They still addressed him as Your Majesty, still bowed, still painted him in glory, even as the man they served rotted alive before their eyes. One of the most horrifying accounts came in the final weeks of his life. A physician reportedly removed a chunk of necrotic flesh from Henry's leg, as large as a fist. When the piece came loose, a gush of black fluid followed, soaking the bed, the bandages, and the hands of the terrified doctor. Henry screamed, then fainted. Some thought he wouldn't wake up again. He did, but something had changed. He stopped speaking for days, refused food. His skin turned waxen, his lips cracked and purple. Still, he refused to see priests. Perhaps he feared what they'd say. Perhaps he knew it was too late. He'd executed his best friends. He'd beheaded 2 wives. He'd dissolved monasteries, looted churches, burned men for owning the wrong book. What prayer could redeem that? And yet, as the days grew darker, Henry seemed to try. He had his children brought to him. Edward, the fragile son he prized above all, Mary, whom he once declared a bastard, and Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the living reminder of the woman he murdered. He looked at them, held their hands, said nothing. But his eyes, they say, were full of something worse than grief, something like regret. In his final nights, the pain grew unbearable. He was given opium, wine, and herbal sedatives, but the body refused to give up easily. The ulcer was now a crater, the size of a hand mirror, raw and festering. His urine was black. His breath wheezed through bloodied lungs. One servant said it sounded like a man drowning in his own body. He hallucinated. He called for Jane Seymour. For Anne, for his mother, for God. But mostly, he just screamed. Sometimes the screams were curses. Other times, just a name. No one knows which name it was. Maybe Catherine, maybe Jesus, maybe his own. And then it stopped. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. But it was not a royal death. There was no great moment of final words, no noble whisper, no hero's exit. He died in his bed, soaked in pus and blood, a king who could not be moved for fear his body would burst open. And even in death, he was feared. His servants did not embalm him right away. They dared not touch the corpse. It lay there for hours. And when they finally lifted him for burial, his body began to rupture. One legend says his coffin leaked. Another says dogs followed the procession, drawn by the smell. None of this may be certain. But one thing is, the man who once called himself the Lion of England was eaten from within, by disease, by guilt, by the weight of his own sins. They say a king's death should be followed by silence, dignity, prayer. But Henry VIII's death left a different silence, the kind that creeps through stone corridors and lingers like rot in the floorboards. For days, no one dared speak of what happened in that bedchamber. The servants burned the linens. The room was sealed. The smell never left. England moved on because it had to. The court dressed in black. Edward VI, just 9 years old, was crowned king. Pale, fragile, and already sickly, the boy looked nothing like the lion his father claimed to be. But he was a legacy, the last desperate result of 6 wives, hundreds of deaths, and one man's obsession with a male heir. The chronicles written after Henry's death tried to preserve the myth. They called him a great builder of the church, a reformer, a strong hand in an age of uncertainty. But in the taverns and the whispered corners of England, people remembered something else. A woman screaming from the tower, a priest burned at Smithfield, a queen weeping as the axe came down, and a king, once majestic, who could not stand, who reeked of death, who had to be carried like a sack of meat to his own grave. Even in burial, the horror followed him. He was interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son, and the only one he claimed to have truly loved. But the tomb was never completed. No great monument, no towering statue, just a plain black marble slab. Beneath it, a body bloated by disease. And beside it, a queen who died giving him what he wanted most, a son, a name, a legacy that would vanish in less than a decade. But perhaps the most terrifying legacy was not what Henry left behind in marble or parliament, but in the mind of England. He had reshaped religion, but left the country in chaos. He had 6 wives, but no true love. He ruled with terror and died alone. And those who saw it, who inhaled that death, who dressed the wound, who heard the screams, they never forgot. One chronicler wrote, "There was once a king so mighty even God stepped back. But when death came, he did not knock. He tore the door from its hinges and dragged the king out, screaming." Even today, historians struggle with Henry VIII. Was he a visionary? Or a madman? A man torn by the pressures of legacy? Or a tyrant who mistook cruelty for command? The answer lies not just in the records or the ruins, but in the psychological wreckage he left behind. His reign created a culture of fear that echoed through centuries. Elizabeth I, his daughter, never married. Mary, his other daughter, ruled with fire and execution. And Edward, the precious son, died before reaching manhood, a whisper compared to the roar of his father. But the question that haunts most is not political. It is human. What does power do to a man's soul? What happens when every voice tells you you're chosen, invincible, above judgment? When you're called defender of the faith one year and execute your own wife the next? When your body betrays you slowly, painfully, and no prayer brings relief? What happens when a man becomes a god in his own eyes and dies as something less than human? Because Henry VIII was not killed by poison or blade. He was killed by something far deeper, a lifetime of excess, cruelty, and guilt that finally consumed him from within. He didn't just die, he rotted, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to rule and nothing left to fear. In the end, the image that remains is not of the majestic king in armor, riding tall on a white horse. It's the man in a silk nightshirt, lying in his own blood, muttering to ghosts. A man once feared by all, reduced to a lesson, a warning. A body that couldn't be touched, a heart that could no longer feel, and a name carved in stone, but forever rotting beneath it.